At 40,000 feet above the Solomon Sea, a single B-17 Flying Fortress held its course toward the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. 17 Japanese fighters had already made contact. The pilot was bleeding from shrapnel wounds to both arms and legs. His bombardier lay slumped over the Norden site, unconscious from a 20-millimeter shell that had exploded inches from his face. Fuel gauges showed reserves dropping toward the point where mathematics would soon override courage. The fortress flew on. The morning of June 16, 1943, broke clear over the Coral Sea, with visibility extending beyond 30 miles in every direction. This was both advantage and catastrophe. For a lone reconnaissance aircraft attempting to photograph enemy installations, clear skies meant sharp imagery. It also meant no clouds to hide in, no weather fronts to disappear behind, no atmospheric mercy. The modified B-17E had lifted off from Port Moresby before dawn, climbing steadily into the tropical darkness. Captain Jay Zeamer occupied the left seat. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski, handled the bombardier station in the nose compartment. Behind them, 8 additional crewmen filled positions throughout the aircraft, each understanding that the day's mission carried them directly toward the most concentrated Japanese air defenses in the entire theater. Their target was Buka, a small island at the northern tip of the Solomon chain. Intelligence needed fresh photographs of the Japanese airfield there. Photographs that would reveal runway conditions, aircraft dispersal patterns, and anti-aircraft positions. The reconnaissance run required flying straight and level for nearly 22 minutes over hostile territory, maintaining precise altitude and heading while enemy gunners and fighters responded to their presence. The B-17E they flew had been stripped of standard bomber equipment and fitted with specialized cameras in the belly and nose compartments. This modification traded offensive capability for reconnaissance function. The aircraft retained its defensive armament, but it would carry no bombs. Its mission was to see, record, and survive. Zeamer brought the bomber to 25,000 feet as they crossed the coastline of New Britain. Below them, the volcanic ridges and jungle canopy of the island passed in silence. Japanese radar installations along the coast had certainly detected them by now. The question was not whether fighters would intercept. The question was how many and how soon. The distance from Port Moresby to Buka exceeded 500 miles one way. At cruise power settings, the round trip would consume nearly all available fuel reserves, leaving minimal margin for evasive maneuvering or course deviation. Every minute spent dodging fighters meant fuel burned that could not be recovered. Every degree off course meant additional miles that might leave them ditching in open ocean. The crew had discussed this calculus before takeoff. They understood that completing the photographic run meant accepting combat while maintaining straight and level flight. They understood that breaking off the mission to evade attackers meant the entire journey became worthless. They had chosen to fly anyway. At Aero 9:35 local time, the first visual contact came from the ball turret gunner. Black specks had appeared against the horizon at their 2 o'clock position, climbing to intercept altitude. The specks resolved into distinct airframes within minutes. Japanese fighters, at least 5 of them, rising from the Buka airfield below. Zeamer made no course correction. The camera equipment required stability. The mission required photographs. He held heading and altitude while the enemy climbed toward them. The geometry of interception in aerial combat follows predictable patterns. A fighter attacking a heavy bomber from below must climb against gravity while closing distance, burning fuel and energy to reach engagement altitude. A fighter attacking from above holds every advantage, converting gravitational potential into speed and maneuverability. The Japanese pilots climbing from Buka faced the former challenge. They would arrive at the B-17's altitude tired, slow, and vulnerable. But they would arrive. The first firing pass came at 09:48. A single fighter swept in from the 11 o'clock position, its nose winking with muzzle flashes. Tracer rounds arced past the cockpit, close enough that Zeamer could track individual projectiles against the blue Pacific sky. The fighter broke away after a 2-second burst, rolling into a diving turn to reposition for another attack. Sergeant Johnny Abel, manning the top turret, returned fire as the fighter crossed his field of engagement. His twin 50 caliber machine guns hammered briefly, brass casings ejecting into the collection bags beneath the turret mechanism. Whether his rounds connected remained uncertain. The fighter continued its diving escape without visible damage. More fighters arrived. By 09:55, the crew counted at least 12 Japanese aircraft orbiting around them. Some held at a distance, assessing. Others pressed closer, testing the bomber's defensive envelope. The B-17's gunners engaged targets of opportunity, short bursts fired at any aircraft that crossed into effective range. The photographic run had not yet begun. Zeamer checked his instruments. Engine manifold pressures held steady. Oil temperatures remained within limits. Fuel consumption tracked against predictions. The aircraft was undamaged, its crew functioning, its mission parameters still achievable. If you want more stories like this, subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Jay Zeamer had arrived in the Pacific Theater in 1942 as a pilot without a crew and without an aircraft. This was unusual. Bomber pilots typically moved through the replacement pipeline attached to established crews, slotting into operational squadrons with aircraft already assigned. Zeamer had been separated from his original unit during the chaotic early months of the war and found himself at Port Moresby with credentials but no command. He had grown up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the son of an engineer. His childhood suggested technical aptitude rather than martial ambition. He studied engineering at MIT before transferring to complete a degree in civil engineering at Cornell. The combination of disciplines gave him an unusual mental framework, an ability to think in systems, tolerances, and failure modes that would later prove significant in combat. Zeamer enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1940, completing flight training at bases across the American South. His instructors noted competence without flash. He flew precisely, consistently, without the aggressive flourishes that marked some graduates. He absorbed technical knowledge readily, but showed little interest in competition or recognition. Those who trained alongside him remembered a quiet presence, someone who asked detailed questions and retained complex answers. By late 1942, Zeamer had attached himself to the 65th Bombardment Squadron of the 43rd Bombardment Group. The unit operated B-17s from primitive strips carved into the New Guinea jungle, flying long-range missions against Japanese shipping, airfields, and installations across the Southwest Pacific. The operational tempo was brutal. Aircraft losses ran high. Maintenance struggled against tropical conditions that corroded metal, fouled engines, and rotted fabric. Zeamer's reputation developed not through heroics, but through reliability. He flew difficult missions without incident. He brought damaged aircraft home when other pilots might have ordered bailouts. He studied his bomber with the attention of an engineer examining a bridge under stress, learning where the structure could flex and where it would fail. The crew that eventually formed around him shared similar temperaments. They were not the loudest pilots and gunners in the squadron. They were the ones who survived. Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski served as bombardier and, on this mission, as nose gunner. He had enlisted before Pearl Harbor and completed bombardier training at a time when the role carried significant prestige. The bombardier controlled the final attack run, taking command of the aircraft through the Norden bomb site during the critical moments over target. Sarnoski had proven accurate under fire, calm in the final approach when anti-aircraft bursts walked toward the aircraft. The rest of the crew filled their positions with similar quiet competence. Sergeant Abel in the top turret, Sergeant Herbert Pugh in the radio compartment, Sergeants Forrest, Dillman, George Kendrick, Johnny Abel, and William Vaughn manning waist guns, ball turret, and tail position. Second Lieutenant Ruby Johnston served as navigator, tracking their progress across hundreds of miles of open ocean where a calculation error could mean disappearance without trace. What distinguished this crew was not individual excellence but collective coordination. They had flown together enough times to anticipate each other's responses. They knew where blind spots existed in the defensive coverage and worked to minimize exposure. They had developed informal protocols for ammunition conservation, target prioritization, and communication during combat. By June 1943, the crew had accumulated enough missions to earn rotation home. Most chose to stay. The war continued. Their aircraft still flew. The bond formed through repeated danger held stronger than the pull of safety. The B-17 they flew on June 16th bore the unofficial name Old 666. The designation referenced the aircraft's serial number, which ended in those digits. Superstitious personnel considered the number unlucky. The aircraft had been relegated to spare status, cannibalized for parts, and largely abandoned by the time Zeamer claimed it. He had spent weeks rebuilding the bomber. He scavenged components from wrecked aircraft across multiple bases. He modified the defensive armament, adding extra gun positions and increasing ammunition capacity. The result was a flying fortress that carried more firepower than standard configuration allowed, an aircraft tailored for the missions Zeamer intended to fly. Those missions were the dangerous ones, the reconnaissance flights that other crews avoided, the deep penetrations into Japanese-held territory that required flying alone, without escort, without formation support. Zeamer had developed expertise in these missions precisely because he understood how to extract performance from his aircraft and crew under extreme conditions. The morning flight to Buka represented the culmination of this expertise. The mission demanded everything he had learned about survival in hostile skies. The previous months had taught Zeamer the rhythms of Pacific reconnaissance. Missions followed predictable patterns of risk and response. Understanding these patterns allowed calculation that other pilots might mistake for recklessness. The Japanese defended their island installations with overlapping layers of protection. Radar provided early warning. Fighter squadrons maintained alert status at forward airfields. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed high-value targets. The combination meant that any American aircraft approaching a defended position faced escalating opposition the longer it remained within detection range. Speed was the reconnaissance pilot's primary tool. Fast entry, efficient photography, rapid withdrawal. Every additional minute over target multiplied the defensive response. The mathematical relationship was roughly exponential. 10 minutes over target might draw 4 fighters. 20 minutes might draw 12. 30 minutes could bring every available aircraft within interception range. Zeamer had learned to minimize exposure through precise navigation and efficient camera operation. His crew practiced the sequence until it became automatic. Cross the initial point at specified altitude and heading. Activate cameras. Maintain constant speed and course through the photographic run. Terminate recording at the final point. Begin withdrawal turn. Every second trimmed from the process improved survival odds. On previous missions, this efficiency had allowed successful photography of targets at Kavieng, Wewak, and along the New Britain coastline. Japanese fighters had responded to each incursion, but Zeamer's tight mission profiles limited their engagement opportunities. By the time defensive aircraft climbed to altitude, the B-17 was already heading home, trading time over target for distance from threat. The Buka mission presented different challenges. Intelligence required comprehensive coverage of the entire airfield complex. This meant multiple passes or an extended single run that covered significantly more area than typical reconnaissance targets. The photographic requirements added minutes to the exposure time, minutes that would allow concentrated fighter response. Additionally, Buka sat at the extreme range of B-17 operations from Port Moresby. The mission profile allowed almost no margin for deviation. Evasive maneuvering that consumed extra fuel could leave the aircraft short of friendly territory on the return leg. Combat damage that reduced engine efficiency could produce the same result. Zeamer had calculated these factors before accepting the mission. He understood that the mathematics were marginal. He understood that Japanese reaction time and fighter strength at Buka could exceed anything he had previously encountered. He chose to fly because the intelligence value justified the risk and because his crew had agreed. The preparation for Buka began days before the actual flight. Zeamer studied every available photograph and intelligence report on the target. He calculated interception times based on estimated Japanese radar coverage and fighter alert status. He plotted multiple withdrawal routes, identifying options for emergency landings on friendly islands if fuel states deteriorated. His crew checked and rechecked their equipment. Gunners cleaned weapons and verified ammunition feeds. The radio operator confirmed frequencies for emergency communication. The navigator updated charts and calculated backup waypoints for navigation by dead reckoning if primary references failed. The night before the mission, Zeamer gathered his crew for a final briefing. He did not deliver inspirational speeches. He presented facts: distance to target, expected opposition, fuel margins, abort criteria. Each man understood his role and the constraints under which they would operate. By dawn on June 16th, they were airborne. The fighter count reached 17 by 1005. Zeamer watched them from the cockpit, tracking their positions through the windscreen and from reports called by his gunners. The Japanese aircraft had organized into loose attack formations, cycling through firing passes while maintaining an orbiting screen around the bomber. Their tactics suggested coordination, pilots communicating to avoid collision and maximize engagement opportunities. The photographic run had begun at 0958. Navigator Johnston confirmed their position over the initial point, and the camera operator activated the belly equipment. From this moment until the final point, Zeamer could not deviate from course. Any turn, any altitude change, any speed adjustment would degrade the photography and potentially invalidate the entire mission. He flew straight. The fighters attacked continuously. The first significant damage came at 1002. A diving attack from the 2 o'clock position put multiple rounds through the cockpit area. Zeamer felt impacts before he registered the sound. Shrapnel tore through his legs and arms, fragmenting metal from airframe punctures combining with projectile pieces to create multiple wound channels. Blood began pooling on the cockpit floor beneath his seat. His hands remained on the controls. The aircraft held heading. Co-pilot Johnston took over throttle management as Zeamer's grip weakened. The bomber required constant adjustment to maintain straight flight, small corrections to compensate for air currents and the asymmetric drag of combat damage. Zeamer made these corrections through increasingly numb hands. His attention divided between the instruments, the sky, and the spreading pain in his lower body. In the nose compartment, Sarnoski continued engaging fighters as they passed through his field of fire. The bombardier's position placed him at the forward point of the aircraft, exposed to frontal attacks with minimal protection. His twin .50 calibers tracked aircraft, sweeping in from ahead, barrel heat building with each extended burst. At 1008, a 20-millimeter shell exploded in the nose compartment. The blast caught Sarnoski across the face and chest. Shrapnel penetrated his torso in multiple locations. The concussion threw him against the bombardier's seat, temporarily unconscious. When he regained awareness moments later, blood obscured his vision and his left arm hung useless at his side. He returned to his guns. The camera equipment continued recording. Throughout the aircraft, other crewmen sustained wounds of varying severity. A waist gunner took fragments in the shoulder, but maintained his position. The radio operator received lacerations from exploding plexiglass, but continued calling fighter positions. The ball turret gunner reported hits against his protective dome, but remained operational. No one requested abort. The mathematics of their situation had become unmistakable. They were more than 500 miles from friendly territory. Fuel reserves allowed return only via direct routing. Every crew member who remained functional increased their collective chances of survival. Every gun that continued firing reduced the probability that the next attack would prove fatal. They flew through the kill zone together. Japanese attacks followed a pattern that the gunners began to recognize. Initial passes came from the front quarter, where the bombers' defensive coverage was weakest before Zeamer's modifications. When these attacks met concentrated return fire, the fighters shifted to beam approaches, sweeping across the aircraft's broadside. The waist gunners responded, forcing further tactical adjustment. The fighters adapted to the top turret's coverage by attacking from below, using the ball turret's limited traverse to mask their approach angles. Sergeant Kendrick in the ball worked his rotation continuously, trying to track targets that appeared, fired, and disappeared faster than his turret mechanism could follow. Time dilated in the cockpit. Zeamer later described the experience as extending seconds into minutes, each moment of combat stretching to accommodate the flood of sensory information and necessary response. His wounds continued bleeding. His instruments continued reading. His aircraft continued flying. The final point of the photographic run arrived at 10:20. 22 minutes of straight and level flight through concentrated fighter attack. The cameras had recorded continuously. The film canisters held intelligence that would shape planning for months. Zeamer began his withdrawal turn. The turn exposed the bomber's vulnerability. Banking an aircraft under attack presents geometric problems that level flight avoids. The defender's guns point in directions dictated by the aircraft's attitude. During a turn, some guns lose their engagement angles, while others gain new coverage. The transition creates momentary gaps that skilled attackers exploit. Japanese pilots recognized the turn immediately. 3 fighters that had been holding at distance committed to simultaneous attack runs, converging on the B-17's exposed flank as it came out of the bank. Zeamer held the turn as shallow as navigation allowed. The return heading required approximately 40 degrees of course change, which he executed over 30 seconds rather than attempting a rapid maneuver. His damaged control cables protested the input. Aileron authority degraded from earlier hits that had frayed the steel lines running through the wing roots. Sarnoski, still bleeding heavily in the nose compartment, tracked the leading attacker through his gun sight. The fighter came in steep, diving from the 11 o'clock position, its closure rate accelerating as gravity added to engine thrust. Sarnoski opened fire at maximum effective range, nearly 800 yards, walking his tracers toward the target as range decreased. His rounds connected. The fighter's engine cowling shattered under concentrated .50 caliber impacts. Smoke erupted from the power plant as oil lines severed and combustion spread to the engine bay. The aircraft broke off its attack run, rolling into a spiral descent that carried it toward the sea below. This was the engagement pattern that would characterize the next several minutes. Japanese fighters pressing attacks into the teeth of defensive fire, absorbing damage that accumulated into mechanical failure. The B-17's gunners could not destroy aircraft cleanly, but they could degrade them, punch holes that caused oil leaks, sever control cables, wound pilots, create the cumulative damage that removed aircraft from combat. The radio traffic from Japanese aircraft during this period was later reconstructed from intelligence intercepts. Pilot communications reflected increasing frustration and concern. The American bomber refused to fall. Its defensive fire remained intense despite obvious damage. Aircraft attempting close-range attacks suffered disproportionate consequences. One intercepted transmission approximately matched the period of heaviest combat. The message, translated after the war, conveyed urgency that formal military phrasing could not entirely mask. The directive called for concentrated attack against the single target, all available aircraft committing to the engagement. This concentration proved decisive, though not in the way the Japanese commander intended. As more fighters committed to attack runs, they created traffic problems around the bomber. Aircraft approaching from multiple vectors risked collision with each other. Firing. Passes had to account for friendly aircraft in the background. The defensive volume around the B-17 became simultaneously more dangerous and more complicated. Zeamer's gunners exploited this congestion. They fired into the spaces where fighters had to fly, creating zones of interdiction that forced attackers to break off or accept damage. The ammunition expenditure was enormous. Belt after belt fed through the twin 50s, barrels glowing with heat that threatened mechanical failure. By 10:30, the fighter attacks began to diminish. Not because the Japanese had exhausted their aircraft, not because the B-17's defensive fire had achieved decisive kills. The attacks diminished because the bombed continued flying southeast, steadily increasing the distance from Buka's airfields. Each mile of withdrawal added to the fighters' fuel consumption. Each minute of pursuit extended their exposure time over open water. The Japanese pilots faced their own mathematics. Continue pursuit and risk fuel. Exhaustion on the return. Break off engagement and allow the reconnaissance aircraft to escape with its photographs. The choice required calculating fuel states, distance to home fields, and the probability that continued attacks would actually destroy the target. One by one, the fighters turned back. Zeamer held course through the final disengagement period. His aircraft had taken catastrophic damage. Fuel leaked from multiple tank punctures. Hydraulic systems had lost pressure. The control surfaces responded sluggishly to input, but the engines continued running and the airframe remained intact. Old 666 flew south. The return flight lasted 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours of maintaining aircraft that wanted to fail. 4.5 hours of managing wounds that continued bleeding despite improvised bandaging. 4.5 hours of watching fuel gauges drop toward levels that might or might not prove sufficient. Zeamer remained at the controls through most of this period, despite injuries that would have grounded any pilot under normal circumstances. His crew needed him in the seat, making the constant adjustments that kept the damaged aircraft flying. He could not leave the cockpit. The flight characteristics of a battle-damaged B-17 differed substantially from the aircraft they had departed in that morning. Trim had shifted as fuel redistributed unevenly between punctured and intact tanks. Aerodynamic drag had increased from the hundreds of holes that now perforated wings and fuselage. Engine performance had degraded as oil levels dropped and cooling systems leaked. Zeamer flew the aircraft he had, not the aircraft he wanted. He learned its new behaviors through continuous small inputs, discovering what it would do and what it would refuse. He found that shallow banks remained possible, but steep turns produced uncommanded roll. He found that airspeed had to be maintained above a higher threshold than normal, or the damaged control surfaces would lose effectiveness. Navigator Johnston plotted their course toward Port Moresby while simultaneously managing his own functions and monitoring Zeamer's condition. The captain drifted toward unconsciousness multiple times during the return, his head dropping before he jerked awake. Blood loss was accumulating effects that willpower could only partially offset. In the nose compartment, Sarnoski had continued manning his position until physical collapse made continuation impossible. At some point during the withdrawal, he slumped over his guns and did not respond to calls from the crew. A gunner who moved forward to check on him found extensive wounds and minimal pulse. There was nothing to be done at altitude and distance from medical care. Sarnoski died before the aircraft reached friendly territory. The other wounded crew members held their positions through the return. They understood that reducing defensive capability risked the entire aircraft if Japanese fighters from forward bases attempted intercept. They understood that their individual survival depended on collective function. They remained at their guns, bleeding, until the New Guinea coastline appeared beneath them. Port Moresby approach received notification of an inbound emergency aircraft approximately 1 hour before arrival. The radio operator transmitted their condition, aircraft damage, and wounded aboard. By the time Old 666 entered the traffic pattern, crash trucks and ambulances had positioned along the runway. Zeamer's landing approach required maximum remaining skill. His hydraulic systems had failed, meaning flaps, and landing gear had to be operated through backup procedures. The gear came down, confirmed by visual check from the waist windows. The flaps extended partially before their actuators failed entirely. The touchdown was hard. The damaged gear absorbed impact poorly, and the aircraft bounced twice before settling into a rough rollout. Zeamer held directional control through differential braking until the bomber slowed to taxi speed, then allowed it to drift to a stop on the runway. He could not exit the aircraft without assistance. Ground crews extracted him from the cockpit and placed him on a stretcher alongside the other wounded. The medical assessment revealed shrapnel wounds to both legs, both arms, and his torso. He had lost enough blood to put him into shock. He required immediate surgery and extensive recovery time. The film canisters were removed from the camera equipment and rushed to intelligence processing. The photographs proved sharp, comprehensive, and tactically valuable. The images of Buka's installations informed planning for operations over the following months. The mission was complete. The Medal of Honor citation for Captain Jay Zeamer, Jr. employed language characteristic of official military documentation. The text described actions on June 16, 1943, over Buka, noting that the captain remained at his station controlling his plane and directing its defense despite being wounded. The citation referenced the volume of enemy opposition, the duration of the engagement, and the successful completion of the assigned mission. What the citation could not capture was the physical experience of those 40 minutes over Buka. The concussive shock of 20-millimeter explosions within arm's reach, the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid and blood mixing in the cockpit air, the vibration transmitted through control column and rudder pedals as hundreds of projectiles punctured the airframe around him. The particular quality of attention required to fly precisely while being systematically destroyed. Lieutenant Joseph Sarnoski received a posthumous Medal of Honor for his actions during the same mission. His citation noted continued engagement with enemy aircraft despite mortal wounds, maintaining defensive fire until physically incapable of further action. 2 Medals of Honor for a single mission represented exceptional recognition. The surviving crew members received Silver Stars and Distinguished Flying Crosses. Official documentation recorded their collective performance without fully conveying what collective performance meant in those circumstances. 10 men functioning as an integrated system while that system sustained progressive damage. Each man dependent on every other man. Each decision affecting the whole. Zeamer spent months recovering from his wounds. The surgeries were multiple. The rehabilitation was extended. He returned to flying status eventually, but not to combat operations in the same capacity. The war had taken what it would take from him. After 1945, Zeamer returned to civilian life. He pursued an engineering career, the trajectory he might have followed had history not interrupted. He did not seek publicity or acknowledgement. He did not write memoirs or give interviews frequently. The war became something that had happened, part of his experience but not the definition of his identity. He died in 2007 at age 88, one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from the Pacific Theater. The nature of aerial courage resists simple articulation. The official language of citations reduces complexity to procedure, actions described in bureaucratic passive voice. The reality exceeds description. A man remaining at controls as his body fails around him. A bombardier returning to guns he cannot properly aim with arms he can barely lift. A crew choosing to complete a mission that mathematics suggests they should not survive. What the records preserve is outcome. A reconnaissance mission completed, photographs delivered, intelligence value achieved. The cost paid in blood and permanent damage distributed among men who understood the price before takeoff and flew anyway. Old 666 never flew combat again. The aircraft's damage exceeded economical repair. It was stripped of salvageable components and reduced to scrap, its service complete. The modifications that Zeamer had installed, the extra guns and expanded ammunition capacity, had contributed directly to survival. His engineering judgment had created an aircraft capable of absorbing the punishment that June morning delivered. The Japanese forces at Buka had committed their full defensive response to a single target. Every available fighter. Concentrated attack doctrine applied to one bomber. The American aircraft had absorbed this response and escaped. The photographs it carried proved that absorption and survival were not only possible, but achievable through coordination, preparation, and precise execution under impossible conditions. This is what citations cannot contain. The knowledge that courage is often quiet, that survival frequently depends on competence rather than inspiration, that the distance between living and dying in aerial combat can narrow to margins measured in seconds, degrees, and the steady pressure of bleeding hands on control columns. The sky over Buka closed behind them as they flew south. The fighters returned to their fields. The bomber carried its dead and wounded toward whatever remained of their lives. The film canisters held shadows of what intelligence needed to know. The mission was complete. The cost was permanent. The record remains.